At the height of the Gulf War, it became possible for some commentators to give the impression that World War III was just about to break out. There were all sorts of elements in that, the Russian involvement, for instance, as Moscow's diplomats moved backwards and forwards between Washington and Baghdad. Saddam Hussein himself hinted that he had nuclear weapons and might be prepared to use them. In all sorts of ways, this seemed to be a much worse and more dangerous and threatening war than any we'd seen before. The Americans themselves said that under certain circumstances they might use nuclear weapons. They threatened to flood Baghdad, and when the war actually came, they used huge armoured earth-moving equipment to bury thousands upon thousands of Iraqi soldiers alive in their trenches. Yet, when the ground war finally started, it turned out not to be much of a contest at all. About a third of all the Iraqi troops in Kuwait had already deserted, and those who were left were hungry and ill-equipped. They'd only volunteered to go to Kuwait in the first place to get away from the harshness of Saddam's Iraq. They never thought there'd be a war. The tank commanders, for instance, would arrive in a place, take the batteries out of their tanks and use them to fire up television sets and music equipment. Even the death squads who were there to shoot down any deserters were just looking for an opportunity to desert themselves. This episode of the Gulf War series gives an objective view of Operation Desert Storm and its full impact.
6 weeks into the war, stealth bombers left on a routine mission to attack Baghdad. A ferocious air campaign was still paving the way for the liberation of Kuwait. That night's target was an intelligence headquarters. The Allies didn't realize British prisoners were inside it.
There's a flash and the whole place just went up. The ceiling came in, the walls were coming down, the tiles were blown off the walls.
Then you hear the second bomb coming in, and by that stage you're fully curled up in a ball, and that's when you hear, and it's deafening as it comes in, and somebody kind of shouted, "Incoming!"
After 3 bombs, I thought, that's it. I'm now going to die. And it was actually a calming experience. I just sat down and thought, I'm going to die.
Despite the destruction, Saddam Hussein was defiant. To liberate Kuwait, the Allies would have to attack on the ground.
The president said, now, Colin, you and Norm are really sure that air power alone can't do it. And my response was, Mr. President, I wish to God that I could assure you that air power alone could do it. But you can't take that chance.
Now all eyes were on Norman Schwarzkopf. In the days before the ground attack, he was haunted by the fear of massive casualties. Schwarzkopf was under pressure. His explosions of temper were common knowledge.
Working with Norm Schwarzkopf was sort of like watching a thermometer. The blood would start around the shirt collar, and then it would work its way up to the jawline and then to the ears. And by the time it got to the ears, you ought to watch out.
Schwarzkopf's staff feared him. The British watched in amazement.
Norman going ballistic put people off their jobs and took their eye off the ball. But on the upside, he was a brilliant military strategist with a lot of experience. He understood the Arabs and the Arab world, and he was a great diplomat and was able to bring nations along and foreign armies along in a way that a lesser man would not have been able to.
When human lives are on the line, you cannot be cavalier. You can't do enough. You cannot do enough. You must do everything you possibly can and leave no stone unturned, and you can't settle. You can never settle for second best or a second-class solution when you're dealing with enterprises of such magnitude that they involve the lives of literally thousands and thousands and thousands of people.
Colin Powell and the American Defense Secretary, Dick Cheney, flew in to check the plans. Schwarzkopf said he'd attack in 2 weeks, not before.
Dick liked Norm, respected Norm, had confidence in Norm. But every now and then, Dick reflected on the fact that this was a very important operation. It was for all the marbles, as we say. And Norm was known to be volatile. Norm was known to be also reluctant. I sort of get the tag for being the reluctant warrior, but you won't find many of my military colleagues who were anxious to race into this before we were ready to race into it.
Despite the bombing of Iraq, Saddam Hussein still had 400,000 troops around Kuwait, behind a barrier of minefields, trenches, and barbed wire. He believed he and his generals could force a bloody stalemate if Allied troops attacked these defenses, and that the lesson of Vietnam was America would not tolerate heavy casualties.
Saddam thought the American troops were not prepared for the experience of battle, and that Vietnam had traumatized the American administration.
Schwarzkopf was worried. He was relying on B-52s from the Vietnam era to destroy the Iraqi forces dug in around Kuwait. They dropped 72,000 bombs. Most fell on empty desert. A mistake in the programming of the B-52's navigation system was discovered. Even then, high winds still blew most bombs off course.
We thought that we would destroy tanks somewhere between the 20 and 30 a day, and we weren't coming anywhere close. We were down in the area of 6 or 8. And so after about 10 days of that, I knew that we had to do something different.
Glosson now sent 2 F-111 jets on a mission that would have far-reaching consequences.
Ready? Now, laser on.
When they reached the Iraqi front lines, the crews saw that even the best camouflaged tank showed up as a white rectangle on their heat-detecting cameras. The tanks had grown hot in the daytime sun.
20 seconds. There's definitely something there. 4-2 is east.
Unlike the B-52s, the F-111s carried laser-guided bombs.
4, 3, 2, 1, impact. Okay, sequence me.
One by one, hundreds of tanks were picked off. Under the constant bombing, the Iraqi army began to disintegrate. The Allies didn't realize, but some 200,000 Iraqi soldiers deserted.
There were nights when the bombing never stopped. It went on and on. They turned night into day. Burning pieces of metal rained down everywhere. The sky was full of planes. As one left, another came. This carried on for not just 1 hour or 2 hours, but non-stop. They were always overhead, always bombing.
Colin Powell and Dick Cheney returned from their visit to Schwarzkopf. They told an impatient George Bush the Allied troops could attack in 2 weeks. Bush was anxious the date didn't slip. Moscow's support, crucial to the coalition, was weakening. Earlier that day, the Soviets had suggested postponing the attack to allow negotiations.
Any action that is taken, we are not going to suit somebody else's timetable, whether he lives in Baghdad or any place else.
When the War Cabinet met to inspect the plan of attack, the President's impatience was tempered with a stark warning. The fighting on the ground would be bloodier than he expected.
I was quite confident we would be successful because we had put together a decisive force. But no plan survives first contact with a real enemy.
Colin made a very eloquent statement warning everybody it was going to be a lot uglier and a lot messier than they thought. The battle would not go as the plans said. and that he had an obligation to warn the president about casualties, that there were unpredictable circumstances in war, and that once it started, the president was no longer in control.
But the president's impatience was justified.
Was targeted by rockets, by missile or by bomb? By rockets.
On Gorbachev's orders, a high-ranking Soviet diplomat traveled to Baghdad. Yevgeny Primakov's mission was to urge Saddam Hussein to accept a face-saving deal. After inspecting the damage, Primakov was taken to a government guest house in central Baghdad.
He came in wearing a long trench coat. It was cold. There was an electric stove on. When we were left alone, I told him, "I'm not a military expert, but if a land offensive begins, your troops in Kuwait will be wiped out. You have a great burden of responsibility." Then he said for the first time quite directly, "Okay, I'm going to withdraw my troops from Kuwait. I just want to be sure that as I retreat, they don't shoot me in the back."
48 hours before the ground attack was due, Iraq's Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz arrived in Moscow. Saddam's admission that he was willing to withdraw had led to frantic Soviet diplomacy to save their old ally from defeat. Aziz went straight to the Kremlin. The Soviet president was waiting. Aziz told Gorbachev he wouldn't accept the UN resolutions that called for Iraq to recognize Kuwait's independence and pay compensation. But he said Iraq would withdraw from Kuwait. Gorbachev thought that was good enough. He telephoned Washington.
Gorbachev called the president saying, "Look, I've worked this out whereby we can get Saddam out of Kuwait without a war."
I told President Bush, "George, you shouldn't just be thinking about how to begin your attack. You should be thinking about how to avoid it. While the generals plan, we should think about how to end the war."
We kept coming back to him and saying, "No, you continually are suggesting approaches which do not require an unconditional withdrawal." And we were never going to accept a negotiating down from the UN resolutions.
Nevertheless, the president summoned his key advisors to a critical meeting. On offer was what they'd always wanted, an Iraqi withdrawal without the need for a bloody land war. But Saddam would walk away unpunished and undefeated. At dawn, the president called Gorbachev to tell him the deal was unacceptable.
Bush could have said, "Okay, let us have a ceasefire and then discuss the other matters." He did not accept the ceasefire. He continued the war according to his own schedule. He didn't care about what Gorbachev said and reached with me. He had a schedule.
The coalition was under strain. The French President François Mitterrand called, demanding more time for diplomacy. But then Saddam Hussein intervened.
We received word that Saddam had blown the oil wells, and I went rushing up to the Oval Office, and Bush used it right then in the telephone call with Mitterrand, sort of, "Francois, we've just received this piece of information that shows that we cannot delay, that Saddam is going to produce a catastrophe in Kuwait. He's already set all the oil wells on fire, and God knows what he may do next." And that pretty well resolved that issue.
Two armies faced each other on the edge of battle.
The coalition will give Saddam Hussein until noon Saturday to do what he must do. Begin his immediate and unconditional withdrawal from Kuwait.
Hundreds of oil wells blazed across Kuwait. Saddam Hussein was destroying what he could not keep. He ignored George Bush's ultimatum. Obeying it would have humiliated him in the eyes of the Arab world.
I have therefore directed General Norman Schwarzkopf to use all forces available to eject the Iraqi army from Kuwait.
More than anything else in those final hours, I was asking myself, what did I forget? What have I missed? What more can I do? Once you have thrown the dice in the air, you can't call them back. At that point, all you can do is wait until they land on the table to see what the numbers come up. And that is a very awkward time because you can just sit there on your hands and wait. There's nothing more you can do.
Schwarzkopf planned for the U.S. Marines to attack first, straight into Kuwait. He hoped this would convince the elite Republican Guard to move south to counterattack. Then, 400 miles to the west, French and American airborne troops would begin encircling the battlefield. Arab armies would support the attack into Kuwait. 24 hours after the initial assault, the heavy armor of the American and British armies would smash through the Iraqi front line and attack through the lightly defended western desert.
I always thought that there was a reason why they left the West open, and that this would be a place where they would lay down a biological attack, whether it be anthrax or whether it be botulism.
The Iraqis had chemical weapons. We knew that. They had biological weapons. We knew that. They had used them. We knew that. And they were going to be fighting what Saddam Hussein called the mother of all battles.
And I had my intelligence staff using terms like chemical killing sack, nuclear detonation area, and this sort of thing to describe possible scenarios as to why that area was left open.
I would wake up in the middle of the night in cold sweat, just thinking about, would they use them? Would they use them in the area out west where there was not a lot of troops, and we thought there must be a reason for that.
Schwarzkopf's plan meant Walt Boomer, the commander of the U.S. Marines, would be the first to lead his men into action. Despite the air war, Boomer feared storming the minefields and barbed wire of southern Kuwait would be a murderous affair, fought under a barrage of Iraqi chemicals and nerve gas. The British had trained to attack with the Marines, but 2 months before, they'd pulled out.
It was a frontal attack, and it was going to be across straight into the Iraqi main defensive positions. And to have gone ahead committing a British division that wasn't even suited to that type of warfare, to that, and take unnecessarily heavy casualties, if I'd agreed to that, I wouldn't have been doing my job, and I think I should have been removed from command.
We were outnumbered when we attacked into Kuwait. Sometimes people have lost sight of that. But in addition to being outnumbered, there was this overriding concern, overwhelming concern about chemical warfare. This just occupied most of my waking moments.
Beneath smoke from the burning oil wells, the assault units pulled on the clumsy charcoal-lined suits that might save their lives in a chemical bombardment. Earlier, concern about Marine casualties had provoked an extraordinary confrontation.
Weather conditions were absolutely critical. And the weather predictions that we were getting at that time were very mixed. The Marines, as you probably know, do not have a lot of heavy artillery and depend upon their aircraft to provide the close air support to replace the artillery. And Walt Boomer came to me and said he was very concerned about launching his attack when the weather was predicted to be so bad.
In his office at the Pentagon, Colin Powell received a call from Schwarzkopf asking for the ground war to be delayed.
But we have a president who is anxious to get this over with. And I went and talked to Norm on the phone and said, Norm, look, this is getting hard to explain. And I took him through why it was getting hard to explain, and he just had it. He exploded and said, you know, you do not understand my problem. You're talking in political terms. If you don't care about the lives of young people, well, I do. That did it. I exploded, and I started shouting back at him. You know, I care as much as you do, but there's a limit, and I have to work in both the political world and the military world.
When you're caught in the middle on something like that, it's not a pleasant position to be in, and it puts you under more strain than you were already under, just in the strain of undertaking the type of thing that we were getting ready to do.
He said, Colin, I think I'm losing it. I feel my head's in a vice. I said, you're not losing it. If you have our total confidence, we got a problem. We'll work our way through this problem. And then about 30 minutes later, Norm called and said, oh, weather's fine. We can go.
Marine engineers began to crawl through the miles of minefields, bunker complexes, and barbed wire that protected the Iraqi front line. As they advanced, they used fiberglass rods to probe for mines so they could mark out safe paths for the first troops to race through.
You see mines everywhere. You can look left and right and you see mines, half-buried mines, full-view mines. Just as far as you can see, you look left and right, and there's desert, and there's just lines and lines and lines and groups of mines out there. We crawled, low crawled, which is on your belly, probing along with the fiberglass rods. 70 meters in front of you, Iraqis. Marine snipers are behind us, trying to suppress Iraqis that are moving through the trench lines. You hear artillery, mortars, small arms.
Constantly under fire, Restifo carved paths through two minefields blocking the main attack. Meanwhile, 17,000 Marines headed for the beaches of Kuwait City. 2 weeks before, a landing had been on the cards, but the defenses were so strong the Marines would have been cut to pieces. Now, Schwarzkopf wanted to convince the Iraqis an amphibious assault was imminent. To reinforce the deception, Lieutenant Tom Dietz was ordered to plant bombs on a beach close to the city, so its defenders would think a landing zone was being cleared.
We swam to a point where we were in about 5 feet of water, the entire time keeping our weapon focused on the beach. We moved in to where we were actually crawling in about 2 feet of water, and then to a point where the bomb was in 1 foot of water. We placed it on the bottom, again our weapons trained on the beach, and we just reversed the process. Then we swam back and rendezvoused with our 2 boats. We were standing there watching, all of a sudden the first explosion goes.
The 16-inch guns of the battleship Missouri shelled the beaches to complete the deception. The Missouri had fought in World War II. Many of its shells were made in the 30s. Within months, the last battleships would be decommissioned and the shells sent to museums. But the bombardment achieved its purpose. Iraqi troops moved to the coast and away from the point where the Marines would attack. The attack began.
I don't think anyone predicted that the Marines would get much farther than maybe 5 kilometers. At the very most, maybe 8. And that then, with the enormous, overwhelming forces that were arrayed in that area, that it would stop the Marines.
We're going through the breach.
But by dawn, the generals realized something remarkable had happened. The Marine columns were driving through the enemy positions, serenaded by loudspeakers playing the Marine hymn.
Iraqi fighting positions.
While Allied aircraft watched for a counterattack, thousands of Marines poured into Kuwait, almost unopposed.
We expected casualties somewhere in the 25 to 30% range. But there was essentially no firefights, essentially no battles. The Iraqis were there, but they elected not to fight. In many respects, they could retreat and they could surrender much faster than we could attack or advance. And that the war really became a war of collection of enemies.
The Marines in the lead tanks headed for Saddam's second line of defense, armored divisions from the regular army.
10th Marines, this is Control. Is the last of your unit on Red 1 yet?
Command posts waited for the first chemical attack.
We got 10th Marines forward through yet?
But Baghdad had taken a decision.
Roger, Division 4.
We didn't think that it was wise to use them. That's all what I can say, that it was not wise to use such kind of weapons in such kind of a war with such an enemy.
If chemicals had killed large numbers of the Marines threading their way through the minefields, the Pentagon planned to flood Baghdad with 6 feet of water.
Knocking off the dams on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers would have caused enormous destruction downstream. The loss of civilian life would have been terrible, and we really had not thoroughly analyzed. We knew how to hit the dams, but I don't know if we analyzed what the effect downstream would have been. But nevertheless, it would have been a good one to threaten the Iraqis with. And of course, there was always the implicit threat of nuclear weapons. I don't think we ever would have used them, but nevertheless, the Iraqis didn't know that. And we could have if provocation was serious enough.
Lay down your weapons, we will not hurt you. We are here to help you.
In these first hours, 8,000 Iraqis were captured.
Be home soon.
In Schwarzkopf's war room, relief mixed with the fear of heavy counterattacks. But the attacks were not materializing. By the morning's end, Schwarzkopf came to realize the Marine success was endangering his plan to trap the Republican Guard. The U.S. Marines had advanced into Kuwait so quickly the Republican Guard hadn't come south to counterattack. Schwarzkopf's plan to lure them to destruction was failing. And the American and British tank forces were not due to attack until the following day. That would give the Republican Guard time to escape.
I decided to move the main attack up to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. One of the principles of the overall campaign was to inflict as much damage on the Republican Guard as we possibly could, and they were sitting very, very deep, out back in the desert. And so, therefore, it became obvious that if we were going to inflict that damage on the Republican Guard, we had to go ahead and inflict it as early as possible.
In the 30 minutes before the troops attacked, British and American artillery fired 11,000 rounds at the Iraqi front lines ahead. For the first time, the British used the MLRS, the multiple launch rocket system. Each rocket exploded above the enemy troops, spraying the ground with hundreds of grenades. In those 30 minutes, over 600,000 MLRS grenades fell on the Iraqi positions. The general leading the attack was a careful and methodical soldier. He'd seen war before. In Vietnam, he'd lost one of his legs.
Memories of Vietnam are very sharp, clear to me. I mean, never far from my mind, and especially during the Gulf War. We didn't say it to each other, but I think we all felt that we're going to do it right this time.
As the barrage lifted, American and British troops surged across the desert. This was the army that had been stationed in Europe to fight World War III against the Soviets. Now, the end of the Cold War allowed it to be unleashed against Iraq. The generals expected 2 days of fighting to breach the front-line defenses, followed by 6 days of fierce tank battles with the Republican Guard.
I thought that we would lose somewhere between, in the breaching units, that we would lose somewhere between 20 and 40%.
The American 1st Infantry Division had the job of storming the trenches to clear a path for the British tanks. To avoid hand-to-hand fighting, they planned to bury alive the Iraqi defenders.
A thought occurred to me, we could actually use these plows to fill in the trenches. In fact, I tested it myself. I got down in the ditch myself and had 2 tanks plow towards me just to see what it did. I learned several things. One is I learned that it happens very quickly. So the defender has a choice to make, but he has to make it very quickly. He can either give up and hop out of the trench. He can try to run down the trench and get away, but he better do those quickly because these things move at an amazing speed down there.
In Washington, it was Sunday morning. President Bush was awaiting news. Heavy casualties risked the destruction of his presidency and the abandonment of the war.
I got briefed just before I went into the church. The president was right ahead of me. I passed him a note that said, "Mr. President, things are going very well." We all went back to the White House. I got out a map from Time magazine to sort of show him exactly what was happening. And I was able to tell him there that things were going extraordinarily well. We had assumed that the toughest part of the ground war in terms of casualties would have been the early hours of that conflict. And in fact, what we were finding was that the air war had been enormously effective and decimated the Iraqi forces, and that they, in fact, were collapsing in front of us.
On the second day, the Marines pushed on towards Kuwait City. Ahead, they believed, lay Saddam's second line of defense, the well-equipped armored divisions of the regular Iraqi army. But for once, the Iraqis had surprise on their side. Out of the burning oil fields on the Marines' right flank, hundreds of Iraqi tanks began to advance. The Americans regrouped. They were facing a counterattack Saddam Hussein had personally approved.
I objected to this. I said I'm not in favor of this counterattack because the divisions that have retreated need to double their strength before they can attack and regain their battlefield positions, and we didn't have those kind of reserves. Saddam said, "No, let's leave the general in charge to sort that out." 2 hours later, they told us the divisions had regained their positions. Saddam looked at me and said, "Didn't I tell you this way is better?"
Need to ask Charlie what time he needs these A6s.
At the Marine Air Operations Center, a response was organized. Orders were passed to a flight of 4 Cobra helicopter gunships stationed at a makeshift airbase near the Kuwaiti border. As the Cobras took off, the Marines on the ground were already fighting the largest tank battle in their history.
We'd got the word that there was an Iraqi counterattack. As we arrived out there, we saw horizon to horizon Iraqi tanks, armored vehicles. And as we started hitting these tanks and things started happening in our favor, the attack basically just ground to a halt. All the tanks stopped, the armored vehicles stopped, the hatches flew open, the Iraqis started bailing out of the tanks and, scrambling around in the desert trying to figure out what was going on.
The Iraqi troops tried to retreat into the oil smoke.
It was like, something out of a, spaghetti western with the tripwire and the horses falling. It was, as you engage these troops with 20 millimeter, it was the first time I'd ever done that, and they just kind of pitch over in the desert.
Over 100 armored vehicles were destroyed.
Flying over the oil wells, it was like something out of Dante's Inferno. The thick black oil field smoke. A littered battlefield, burning tanks. Aircraft flying around. very surrealistic, and you almost had to slap yourself in reality to go out there and do your mission.
Saddam was told the advance on Kuwait City had resumed.
He was very upset. He was deeply depressed, and for reasons known only to himself, he accused 5 top-ranking officers of betrayal and then ordered their execution. The sentence was carried out immediately by his personal guards.
Once we broke that counterattack, we broke their back. That was the last gasp on their part to throw us back out of Kuwait. And from then on, we had a pretty straight shot into the city.
That night, a Scud missile landed on an American barracks, killing 28 soldiers, the worst casualties so far.
All the people are up here!
Saddam Hussein had always hoped casualties would undermine American resolve. But now it was too late. Saddam issued a general order to withdraw. In Kuwait City, Iraqi soldiers began to pile into every vehicle they could find. A vast convoy took shape. These pictures were taken by the Kuwaiti resistance.
I frequently talked to the resistance in Kuwait City via satellite telephone. I picked up, and it was a colonel from the Kuwaiti Air Force who'd been trapped in Kuwait City, and he'd been in the resistance all this time. He started to tell me about the Iraqis forming up and fleeing the town. He became so emotionally happy, relieved, overjoyed about his country being freed, the terrible oppressors leaving. He started to cry. I'm embarrassed to say it, but I started to cry as well. I've never been so touched in my entire life.
An F-15 crew, their aircraft laden with bombs for an attack into Iraq, was given a new mission. They were told to attack the convoy leaving Kuwait City and stop it at all costs.
As we dove out of the clouds, the picture was absolutely astounding. There were thousands of headlights heading on every road that led north out of Kuwait City.
It's almost like hitting the jackpot. I mean, there are vehicles all over the place. It is a very lucrative target.
We had 12 500-pound bombs, and we elected to drop them 3 at a time.
The bombs impact in a string right across the highway, with the center bomb impacting on in between 2 trucks, as a matter of fact, causing both of the trucks to burst into flame.
It might have been disorganized, but this was an armed retreat. They were shooting from the vehicles. They were shooting from manned sites on either side of the road. Missiles were fired, some randomly, some aimed.
Krauss and Seidel's bombs destroyed the lead vehicles and created a huge traffic jam. Soon, other aircraft arrived. They had had time to load up with cluster bombs. The pilots called it the Highway of Death. 3 days into the land war, the army that had occupied Kuwait City no longer existed as a fighting force. Thousands of footprints led off into the desert. Hundreds had been killed. In the coming hours, what had happened here would become an important factor in ending the war.
This was not a bunch of innocent people just trying to make their way back across the border to Iraq. This was a bunch of rapists, murderers, and thugs who had raped and pillaged downtown Kuwait City, and now were trying to get out of the country before.
Later that day, the British also experienced the destructiveness of air power. The British division had peeled away from the main American thrust to attack the Iraqi reserves behind the old front line. Mostly it was a matter of rounding up thousands of demoralized soldiers. Iraqi troops, killed only one British soldier. But just before 3 o'clock, British troops captured an Iraqi position known as Objective Steel. 2 British warriors, full of infantrymen, took up position near the Iraqi trenches. What happened next remains controversial. The British say they told the Americans where they were. The Americans deny this. What is certain is that while the British prepared to destroy the Iraqi emplacements, 2 American A-10s concluded the warriors were enemy tanks.
It was just like a flash. And then suddenly you got this searing pain across your face and your hands up.
And then all of a sudden, I had this vision of myself floating up towards the air, and I remember saying to myself, "Well, you know, that's your numbers up, sort of thing. Now you're on your way to heaven."
And I looked down and I saw this blood coming through my clothing from the top of my thigh, and realised then at that stage I'd been hurt.
Trevor was crawling on his hands and knees and his belly towards the rear of the vehicle. It was all black. There was, he'd suffered burns, he'd suffered leg injuries.
I look in the back of the vehicle, and what I saw in the back of my vehicle, I would never want to see anything like that again in my life.
And I realised that two lads who died in the rear of the vehicle, who was sitting next to me.
And I see the second vehicle, the vehicle that had come around to help us, is suddenly going in and out like a pressurised can. It's expanding and contracting and expanding and then contracting. And I realised in that split second that that vehicle was going to explode.
9 men died. Friendly fire killed at least 35 Americans, a quarter of their dead.
In war, people get killed, it's inevitable. We're fighting against them, they're fighting against us. If it'd been an Iraqi plane, well, fair dues, you'd expect to be shot at by the enemy, but you don't expect to be shot at by your own side.
An American spy plane now recorded this radar image of the battlefield. It showed the Republican Guard, Saddam Hussein's best troops, starting to escape. To Schwarzkopf's fury, American forces had yet to engage these elite divisions, over 60,000 men and their tanks.
Here we have the golden opportunity to accomplish far beyond our dreams what it is we set out to accomplish, and to get this thing over once and for all very quickly. And it doesn't seem like we are able to capitalize on that opportunity.
The American tanks were driving hard. Schwarzkopf wanted them to drive harder. He had assumed the Republican Guard would move south to defend Kuwait, but they hadn't, and the Americans were struggling to make up the distance. Schwarzkopf wanted a headlong charge. The commander on the ground was more cautious.
You get a probability of increased casualties. You get the probability of an attack that starts and stops and starts and stops, loses momentum. I wanted to hit the Republican Guards with a 3-division fist. I didn't want to poke at them with fingers, in other words, piecemeal commitment of my forces. I want to hit them with a fist at full speed,
General Schwarzkopf indicated, Freddie, let's get this mission accomplished, and let's do it ASAP.
On the 3rd afternoon of the war, battle was finally joined with the Republican Guard. An armored cavalry troop of 9 tanks and 12 infantry carriers was leading the American advance. Ahead, behind a slight rise in the desert, Republican Guard tanks waited in ambush. The first tank approached.
As we crested the rise, my gunner identified tanks to our direct front, and he said, "Identified tanks." I yelled, "Fire!" As the other tanks crested the rise, they began to select their targets and engaged in an almost simultaneous manner.
So 15 seconds before, there was a cohesive or coherent Iraqi defense. 15 seconds later, that defense was completely in flames. When we look back over the armored vehicles, you think, my God, this is what an armored cavalry troop in the assault can accomplish in that short amount of time.
They called it the Battle of 73 Easting, after the map coordinate. 28 Republican Guard tanks were destroyed. That night, the Americans routed an entire division of the Republican Guard. The other 5 Republican Guard divisions started a desperate retreat. Their best hope of survival came from an unlikely quarter.
Colin Powell and Dick Cheney came over to the White House to give the president their daily report on how the war was going. And by that time, we knew both from the military reports and from satellites about the highway of death leading north out of Kuwait City and the incredible destruction of the Iraqi convoys and so on. We knew all this would eventually be on television. And I remember very clearly Colin Powell saying that this thing was turning into a massacre, and that to continue it beyond a certain point would be un-American, and he even used the word unchivalrous.
While the American army battled the Republican Guard, the Iraqi positions around Kuwait lay empty. American Marines gathered outside the city. The question now was whether the Republican Guard could be destroyed before it became politically expedient to stop a war which had already achieved its main purpose: the liberation of Kuwait.